Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Shaken Not Burned. I'm your co-host Giulia Bottaro. And today we're going to talk about the energy transition. The energy transition has now entered the mainstream discourse, with politicians and companies talking about this concept, which can at times seem a little bit abstract. Maybe our lives don't look much different at the moment. Perhaps we see more electric vehicles on the road or more solar panels or roofs. But there is a huge amount of work going on in policy and industry to decarbonise our energy systems. And this brings enormous opportunities for the economy. In this episode, I interview Isabella Suarez, Southeast Asia lead at TransitionZero, to understand where we are with the energy transition. Thank you so much, Isabella, for joining us today.
Hi, Giulia. Thanks so much for having me.
So why don't we start with the very basics, and you are the expert. Please explain us what the energy transition means.
Great, I'll do my best. So the energy transition is essentially a shift from fossil fuel-based energy systems. So think your traditional coal, oil, and gas-fired power plants, industrial processes, and all of that. And the energy transition is basically thinking about shifting from that type of system to a renewable energy or a zero carbon-based system. So that's on the technology side. What this means in practice is an entire restructuring of how we generate, distribute, and consume power. And that has a lot of cascading effects to the rest of our lives. So this has an impact on supply chains, on manufacturing, on economies, and how we generate revenue and create jobs. So it's a massive endeavor. And it's essentially rethinking of the way that we power and our economies.
Okay, so no big deal at all, just super easy. When we hear about mostly politicians and also lots of companies, they talk about goals like net zero. Mm-hmm. What is the relationship between these targets and the energy transition?
So targets are like net zero, seek to reduce emissions or greenhouse gas emissions like carbon and methane. Net zero specifically sets that target at bringing emissions down to near zero, or as close to zero as possible. And this can happen at like a global level. On one hand, we need to do this at a global level. On another hand, at a national level. And this can also happen at a company or an individual level as well. Reducing your emissions can happen at an individual level. For net zero, so this reduction of greenhouse emissions is really important when we talk about energy transition because the energy sector is about 75% of global emissions. It's fluctuated between the years, but if you think about the power sector, the industrial sector, and transport and even aviation, those are really heavy emitting industries that need, and we need to bring the emissions of those industries down.
So transport counts as the energy sector is part of that whole realm.
Yes, the transport sector is part of the energy sector. I think in general, if you think any sector that burns coal, oil, and gas.
That's just a massive number of things when we start thinking about it. So when we're talking about the energy transition, when would you say the conversation about doing something started and how much progress has been made so far?
When we talk about the energy transition, I think this is something that has developed alongside the discussion of addressing climate change. So this can go back all the way, I think if we're talking about milestones, to the 1990s or 1997 with the Kyoto Protocol, which addressed the need for developed countries to reduce their emissions. That's obviously developed very much since then. There is a big conference that happens every year that's called the Climate Change Conference, or COP for short. And this year will be the 30th year that conference is going to happen. So it's something, or this idea that we need to transform our energy systems or transform the way that we do business in order to reduce emissions has been around for decades. And there's been a lot of progress that's been made. I think especially in the last 5 years, 3 to 5 years, we've seen a lot of countries put together national plans to transition the energy sector. One of the levers of this is really not just acknowledgement that this is important, but that the technologies that will allow us to do this, particularly solar and wind, have come to a point where the costs have gone down and the economies of scale have gone up, that they can be deployed at scale. So over the last 5 years, we've been hitting really important milestones for the construction of these enabling technologies. We are seeing reforms that are happening in the EU, in the US, in China, India, these really large emitters, as well as in small but very important countries like Indonesia or Singapore or Vietnam. Southeast Asia is the region that I work on, so it's very close to my heart. But I think these two things, these three positive things have happened. So policies have been put in place to address, create a roadmap for the energy transition. The second thing that's happened is there is a cost reduction that's happened in the low-hanging fruit or the technologies that we need to decarbonize. And the third thing that's happened also is there's a lot of investment, research, and planning that's going around the next layer of technologies that are needed to really bring us to net zero. So I think those are the positives, but we're talking about this at quite a turbulent time when you're also seeing a bit of backsliding around those commitments and those principles. The key one being that the US has now withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. That's a fairly big blow. The US is one of the largest historical emitters as a country. And so it means that other countries who acknowledge the importance of doing this together feel that this infrastructure or this really important global agreement is breaking down. And you'll see it in the news nowadays where there's a reversion back to ideas that coal is clean or coal is a renewable energy technology, which is something for many years we've gone past that. So yes, it's a lot of progress has been made. And I think in terms of the positives, like I said, the technological development means that there's very little you can do to stop solar and wind now that they're competitive. But this backsliding in terms of ambition for addressing climate change and reaching net zero means that progress can stall.
The fact that these technologies are cheaper, it means that ultimately people might still want to go for them, right? So it becomes more like a sensible, like a practical choice rather than like philosophical, we need to do this for climate change.
Yes, for sure. And I think that's one of the positives that we've also seen in the last few years, that solar and wind are viable technologies and attractive technologies, not just because they're clean, but because they can also address several myriads of issues that exist within the energy sector. So one thing that is important, for instance, in developing countries is the access to electricity or access to energy. Energy poverty is still a major issue in many parts of the world. And one of the reasons this is so is because building infrastructure or power plants like coal, oil, and gas are multi-year endeavors. They're very expensive and they are large infrastructures that are usually constructed in very specific parts. And then you need to have additional infrastructure like transmission, distribution lines to get that to consumers. And with solar and wind, solar in particular, you now have these mechanisms or these setups that allow for rooftop solar to happen on top of households or industrial parks, or the ability to build solar in more remote areas and have that cater to, villages or areas there. So yeah, there's an access thing that this also addresses. But the other thing that we're also noticing, or that we've noticed, especially with the COVID years, is that the supply chains around coal, oil, and gas, there are specific countries that are able to mine or produce these types of commodities and it's shipped to the rest of the world. And that creates an interdependence. But there's an issue around energy security, is what we like to call it, the ability to produce your own energy. That is a big issue for many countries, or has become apparent as an issue, given the dependencies on supply chains and how that's broken down over the last few years. So that's another thing that solar and wind address, or things like hydro address. When you have these very rich renewable energy resources in your country, it's also a economic driver to capitalize on those.
We actually had the whole episode on building solar in Italy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but in Italy, obviously, there is a lot of sun and wind, not so much, not in a way that, is doable to produce energy. But there is loads of sun, loads of agricultural land sort of left abandoned because it's not economical anymore. And yet the government isn't doing anything to push for it or incentivize it. And in fact, there are laws that actively limit the build out of solar panels on these lands. And it's like, and then you see politicians complaining on television that gas is really expensive and prices will go up and we need more gas. But we've got the sun. So sometimes it feels very confusing why we're just not going for these simple solutions.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, that's a great example, and something that I think most countries and most people wrestle with, because I think the big headlines nowadays talk about the way that costs have plummeted and how accessible it is now. But there are two things that happen, which is you yourself as an individual don't necessarily see the benefits of these type of technologies. And the second thing is that even though costs have come down, the reality is what you're describing, that most of the policies or the regulations and the systems in place still favor fossil fuel. They have a systemic advantage, and that can also hinder the deployment of these technologies.
I like how you said systemic advantages. Yeah, it sounds really crucial, like the key word probably for this episode. But why are we so dependent on fossil fuels? How did we get here?
I think they're probably better history nerds than me, but I think with the Industrial Revolution, going back all the way there, countries and our systems are literally built on these technologies. And so it's very difficult to change that way of plan. Well, first of all, the infrastructure already exists. And as I mentioned earlier, these are not inexpensive infrastructures. And we've continued building them well into the 21st century. So in places like Southeast Asia, for instance, the fleet of coal plants are very new. And so they have to be utilized in order for them to be paid back for the investment that's one issue. So we have that everything is built on top of these. We've continued building them. We'll have to continue operating them, especially in countries that have growing demand. And the other reason why that remains to be the case, sort of like have to, is because the way that we plan our energy systems, for the most part, still relies on these types of technologies. They still account for majority of the share of generation around the world. And you're having to not only build new sources of energy to meet growing demand. That's another issue that's another reason why it's so difficult, because our demand, our energy demand continues to increase for most parts of the world. So you're having to build new capacity to meet that while also having to replace the old one. The other reason, aside from policy and regulation that I mentioned earlier, that sort of has preference or has built an entire system that caters to fossil fuels, is also because in terms of the way that we dispatch energy, for instance, the way that we make steel and cement, those are very much reliant on fossil fuels. The other thing is on the planning side, and this is something that I've noticed particularly in Southeast Asia, there is this idea that we need baseload technologies. And baseload is a feature of demand. It's the sort of the constant threshold of energy that you have per day, per week, per month. And so that's the level of energy or electricity that you need to meet for the lights to stay on.
Okay, so that's what baseload technologies mean, like what we use every day, basically, too.
Yeah. So, but baseload is as a concept is primarily related to demand. You have a constant baseload, And that has traditionally been attached to these old technologies. And what's happened is that in terms of planning, there's still that preferential treatment of baseload or technologies that can run 24/7. When what we need to move towards is more flexible ways of planning and operating our system. Because the reality is that renewables are variable. They will generate more if it's sunnier or if it's windier. And so that there's that behavior that we have to adjust to. But if we're constantly thinking or just prioritizing this idea of like stable 24/7 electricity, then you default to these technologies. When we say, it's of course very important to meet that baseload, we do need to keep the lights on. But there is now, we now need to move to this idea that we need systems that are able to ramp up and down to meet demand. And we need to be able to plan for it. So renewable energies are variable, but they're not intermittent. They're not just going to shut down in the middle of the day unless there's something wrong with the plant. So we need to be building enough power to meet that existing demand and growing demand and also replace old ones. But that gets us to the challenge, right? Like that is a lot of investment. That is a lot of construction. And on the flip side of it, these are still technologies that require, aluminium, lithium, and rare earth metals, for which the process of extraction can also be emissions heavy.
Yeah, it's really complicated. So just to clarify, these technologies that help with the flexibility, are we talking about battery storage?
We're talking, I think, about everything. So we do need to diversify our systems. We need to build in more places. We need to ensure that our grid is well developed enough to bring the new supply to the data centers. And we also need to account for that variability. So that's where things like storage become really, really important.
Okay. And do we have technologies like types of storage that actually work? That are commercial, that are viable? Because I think there was a time a few years ago when this wasn't maybe it wasn't sure whether the storage that we have is enough to cope with this demand.
Yeah, I think it's still a challenge. And the thing about batteries and storage is that the costs are still coming down. There are alternatives like pumped hydro. So you have a reservoir and then you can deploy it when you need like additional power. That's a form of storage. We have, I think, the technology for shorter duration storage, so up to 4 hours, is good, and the costs are coming down. I think where the challenge still remains are in long duration storage. So
what is long duration?
Things that go up to like 8 hours.
Okay.
Yeah, so you need to be able to cover the periods when, let's say, sun is not shining, like the evenings, and the longer that you can cover it with storage, the better it is for the system.
You also mentioned the grid earlier. So is it true that we need to sort of overhaul most countries' grids to cope with increased electrification?
Yes, it is true. There are several things here. So as I mentioned earlier, we are going to the places that are rich in renewable energies like solar and wind won't necessarily be the same areas that have existing coal, oil, and gas. So we're going to need to build those new solar, wind, biomass plants, as well as bring them to the demand centers. So that requires additional transmission. The problem that we're experiencing now is that grid or transmission infrastructure is something that has experienced underinvestment for decades now. So you're seeing in places like everywhere, actually, from in Europe, in the US, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, the transmission lines have not expanded significantly in the last 10 years. And now you're seeing a lot of plants that have come online, renewable energy plants, and they have not been able to connect themselves to the grid. And there's a bottleneck of the projects that need to be connected to service the grid. And this is a big problem also, like financially, because those projects are ready to be deployed. They just do not have the supporting infrastructure that brings them on the grid and allows them to start generating power and also getting revenue.
So who should be building this infrastructure in that situation? Is it like the government, the utility companies, the renewable operator themselves?
It really depends on the country. I think one of the reasons why the energy transition is also really complex is because different countries have different markets, have different ways of planning and approval, have different bodies that are responsible. Sometimes it's the state, sometimes it's an open market. Yeah, so it really depends. You will often have a transmission operator or DSO that is responsible for building infrastructure. Sometimes, depending on the country, there's also the ability to build transmission if you're a private corporation.
And I'm now going back to something you said a while ago, but I just wanted to follow up on that. You mentioned that we need to learn how to live differently with the flexibility of renewables. So how would that look like in the everyday life of an individual or a business?
Yeah, so we've largely been talking about supply for the last few minutes, and you're hitting on this idea of demand. So it's demand cover. So on the demand side, there are things that we can do that assist as well in the energy transition. So energy efficiency is one really important one. Ensuring that our appliances, the tools that are used are the most efficient, because that means that they need less technology. But the other side is demand side management, or demand side response. So this can be for big consumers like wherein they are operating in the hours of the day where there is more surplus energy. So you distribute sort of the demand or the requirements that come out of the grid to the hours of the day when you say you have more wind that's blowing, but everybody else is asleep at night. This can also go to individual consumer habits as well. So things as simple as turning off your lights when you're not using them, or removing a plug when you're not using them as well, because that has phantom energy. But it can also be related to the times of days when we are consuming energy. So when we think about, when everybody leaves the office, everybody wakes up at the same time, starts the day, there's usually a spike in energy at the start of the day, which then goes a bit down when people are going about their day, leaving their houses, going to offices, being in more centralized places. And then it goes back up when we go home, because we're cooking, we're doing our chores and all of these things. But there are types of, load or activities that can be scattered throughout the day. So things like turning on your washing machine or when you're doing your dishes, like those can be delayed to the parts of the day when not everybody is consuming electricity. So we also need that flexibility on the demand side. There are a lot of tools now, or a lot of devices that make these automated. There are a lot of new service providers in the energy side that assist in getting you to consume electricity on the times of the day when it is cheapest for you. And all of these things are really important in terms of ensuring that we are addressing the energy transition from end to end.
So it's not like revolutionizing our lifestyles. It's more like a little change in mindset.
Yeah, I think so. It's, being more practical and being more efficient with how we use our energy.
And if the world wanted to, if everyone sat down and agreed on this, could we drop fossil fuels tomorrow? Or is it just not a quick fix?
For the reason that I said earlier, the fact that there are many countries and many industries that are still dependent on fossil fuels, I can't really practically say that if we all decided to drop fossil fuels tomorrow, that we could do it. However, I think that if we all decided that this was something very more important than we already have, like this is the most essential thing to addressing climate change, I think that we could be moving a lot faster to get us to a place where this would be possible.
When you go, I go to events, conferences on sustainability, blah, blah, and there's always this discussion on when is oil demand expected to peak, which I suppose is something that people ask because it helps companies with planning or governments.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know, why is it so important to think about this, and what is the date at the moment when oil demand will peak?
It really depends on who you're speaking to. And the thing about all of these ideas of peaking is everyone has a different methodology to get to it. Like if you just Google when does oil demand peak, which is probably why you're asking the question as well, People like Goldman Sachs will say like it's a decade away. EA says that it's going to reach peak demand by 2030 because oil demand is growing. So there are really a lot of factors that go into this. And because of my background and expertise, I don't think I can confidently give you a date as to why. But I think the concept of peaking, not just in oil, but you'll see it also for like coal peaking or gas peak date, is just that we do need that sort of threshold versus on the climate side as well as on the economic side for when these industries stop growing. Because as you mentioned earlier, that has implications for planners everywhere. And I think when these commodities, stop growing and start coming down, we are seeing sort of that crucial pivot point of transitioning the system away from these technologies that have been growing for years. I think it's a really important inflection point in terms of addressing climate change.
Yeah, and I suppose the later these peak years go, the more we know the action is being delayed.
Exactly, yes.
Are there any low-hanging fruits that global leaders are not taking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that there are several. I think energy efficiency is one really important one. I think that the addressing the grid is another really important one. I wouldn't call it an easy task, but it is a low-hanging fruit in terms of ensuring that we have both a reliable system that is able to handle the influx of renewables that we needed to, as well as increasing access or improving access to electricity in many parts of the world. I think that deploying as much solar and wind as possible is also a low-hanging fruit. And for many countries, this means streamlined permitting processes, beneficial for both the developers or the market, as well as for the government. Any like prolonged streamlined processes means additional resource. Yeah, I think those would be.
For our listeners, for professionals or companies that may want to start thinking about their energy usage, or how can they take part in the energy transition?
I think looking at energy usage is something really important. The thing that has happened over the last few years is that you now have tariffs that can be attached to renewable energy specifically, or there are providers that, wherein if you buy your electricity from a certain provider, you have an increased guarantee that it's coming from renewable energy, or that what you're paying for goes towards investment of renewable energy. So that's one. I think even just noticing the behavior of and how you generate electricity is another really interesting thing. I remember when the first time I started living alone and I had to pay my own electricity bills, I just didn't realize how much I was consuming by leaving everything on. And I think it's just a really practical habit to start noticing where you can be more thoughtful about the way that you can consume energy. It helps your pocket and it helps the environment. But I think just also looking at, for companies in particular, I think looking at the current operations and where electricity consumption can be reduced or move towards more sustainable measures in general is really important. There are a lot of resources out there. One of the things but there are also a lot of barriers to this as well. One thing that I didn't touch on earlier, but that I think is also relatively low hanging fruit is I think we need to be better about our disclosures and more transparent in our data. Because what's happening now, everyone feels that we need to move more quickly on the energy transition. But sometimes this is a massive endeavor and it requires many stakeholders, and not all stakeholders are in consensus. And one of the reasons for this is sort of the lack of data or the lack of information. So I think that trying to encourage more transparency, I think companies themselves need to look at what they're doing. There are a myriad of things that encourage companies to look at their own disclosure, their own financials, how this is supporting fossil fuels at a larger scale, but also so I would say those things.
Thank you. Is there anything else you would like to add that we've not covered? I know that there is so much to discuss, and we've tried to condense it, but maybe we've forgotten some bits.
we've been talking like very big picture on the energy transition. And I think anyone who's interested, I really just encourage you to look at what this means in more granular levels. So it's very different per country. It's very different for each corporation. And I think what's important is that we just start being knowledgeable about the roles or or where we're currently at. I think the thing that I also like want to emphasize is that the speed and scale of the energy transition and how countries go about it will be really different because the resources available to countries are very different from the renewable energy side. The structures that are in place that preserve that fossil fuels or that rely on fossil fuels are also very, very different. The political structure as well is also different. So I think this is where ambition has always bumped heads with like reality. But what I find to be encouraging, at least in the markets that I look at, is that people are having very serious discussions about what the energy transition means and what that could look like for the reasons that I outlined earlier, that it's not just about decarbonization, it's also about energy security, it's also about energy affordability. So I think we are moving towards that point. I guess it's just important to think that everybody has different scenarios or different ideas of how this transition will play out. And we just have to be very realistic about that, because without that realism, we don't get to address those bottlenecks. We don't get to address the real blockers to the energy transition.
Thank you so much, Isabella, for this great episode. And thank you so much to our listeners for tuning in once more. Don't forget to follow us on social media, subscribe to our channel and our newsletter. And see you next week.